Do you want to take Jonathan in Arizona?
Sure.
Hey, Jonathan, how are you doing today?
Good. Hi, V. Hi, Matt.
Hello.
Hi, Jonathan.
What you calling in about?
Yeah, so, actually, I called and talked to V and Eric a couple weeks ago under the same pretenses where V and I were having an email exchange. And coincidentally...
Hello, Jonathan.
Yeah.
Hello again.
Hi, yeah. Coincidentally, I had sent Matt an email the other night, and he responded yesterday. And I was like, hey, what a great opportunity to not have to do the email thing and just talk.
Well, what can we help you with? Also,
yeah,
do you want to kind of summarize what the email was about first so that we've got everyone on the same page?
Some context. Yeah, absolutely. So basically, I had quoted Matt saying that you can't use the Bible to prove the Bible, and because you need to have independent attestation for it. So I was specific. I sent the email specifically asking about the New Testament, that it's a compilation of independent attestations that just happens to be like in one book, and how it makes sense to say you need independent attestation of now what is a collective of independent attestations. So I was just like trying to understand the reasoning behind that.
Yeah, I remember this, and I also remember being incredibly pleased with my response and thinking that this would require no further discussion.
What was your response?
Yeah.
So the Bible the New Testament is a collection of different accounts. The problem is that, first of all, we don't know who the authors are for a lot of it. We don't have any way to investigate it. It was put together by biased sources. And instead of being a collection of independent affirmations of something, it is far closer to a collection of ghost stories told by different people. And so you can put together, the plural of anecdote is not data. And so you can put together as many claims about this particular ghost story as you'd like, and yet that isn't enough on its own to confirm anything. You would need independent verification of the facts, not just more people telling a story, especially if you have no way to investigate it.
And especially if it's been proven that they're building off of each other.
Right.
Well, I mean, you would kind of expect that from independent sources that are talking about the same story, wouldn't you? I mean, the example I gave as comparison was, it sounds like you could say the exact same thing in school reading a history book.
No.
A history book is a compilation of... I'm sorry, go ahead, Matt.
So do you believe that people are being abducted by aliens?
I really don't.
I don't either. And yet we have countless stories from people, and these stories are incredibly similar, including the descriptions of what the ships look like, including the descriptions of what the aliens look like. So there's a collection of independent attestations, and yet it is insufficient because the nature of the claim is such that we would require more. 100 people tell me that there's a new pet at the local pet store that's unlike anything I've ever seen. I'm going to go down and look for it. If they tell me they all got new dogs, I'm just going to take them at their word. But people tell me that they were abducted by aliens, or that they've seen ghosts, or that there's a man who turned water into wine, walked on water as if it were dry land, raised the dead, healed the sick, etc. Those things require investigation and evidence beyond just the claim. And so if you aren't willing to believe that people are being abducted by aliens, when you can actually go meet and talk to those people who made those claims, so you can get their firsthand accounts, how could you possibly believe a document thousands of years old that is a copy of a translation of a copy of an oral tradition by somebody you don't know and is so far removed from you temporally that you can't even investigate it?
Right, and I'm not actually like trying to make an argument for the truth of the claims of the New Testament. I'm just looking for like consistency on comparing what you're saying to something that's, another historical event that has the exact same source material, but you're not saying it needs to be independently attested.
Well, usually when we talk about historical documents, we are talking about we need verification from non-biased sources. And so when somebody reports on a war that happened, if all of your information is coming from one side of that war, now all of a sudden all of their views are suspect. But if people on both sides of a war are reporting the same facts, where those facts overlap, now you have a good reason to think you are closer to the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not like the New Testament is a collection of biased and unbiased sources. And when you go outside of the New Testament, when you go to somebody like Josephus, who is an actual historian, albeit very early and perhaps not with the best methods, you don't have those independent, unbiased historians confirming the facts of the Bible. Even in the testimonium within Josephus's work, which is probably an interpolation because it probably didn't exist in the originals. But even if it were there, all it really attests to is that there are people who believe this happened. It's not testifying that this thing actually happened. And that would be me like writing a news story about flat earthers. And then in 2,000 years, there'll be people who go, wow, there were people who believed the earth was flat as late as 2019. And that's completely different from the earth is flat.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and some of that makes sense. Some of it, just to be honest, it doesn't seem to make sense because we're referring to Josephus saying, all he was saying is people at the time believed it. He does make specific claims, at least, the crucifixion of Jesus under Pilate and Jesus having a brother named James. I mean, those are specific. Those aren't just, hey, a bunch of people at the time believed it. Those are specific attestations of, certain claims of the New Testament.
No. These are not claims of fact. These are claims about what people believe. Josephus wasn't even alive when these things occurred.
Right. You can be extremely specific and still be wrong.
Right. Okay. So, yeah, I guess I do have to backtrack because Josephus was like beginning of the first century, if I'm not mistaken, beginning of the second century, something like that.
Something around 60, 75, I think, is when he was born. I might be wrong in the dates, but at best, he was talking to second or third hand sources, and he's reporting on what they believe to be true. He cannot report these things actually happened.
Right. And I guess in all fairness, in 100 years, nobody will be able to actually say that the Holocaust actually happened.
Except that we have documents from Holocaust survivors.
And we can go to concentration camps.
And people on both sides.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we can, again, in 100 years, you could say, well, I don't know that those were actually written by the people who survived the Holocaust. I mean, you could be skeptical to the point where it's,
You could, but we are at a point where the documentation process is much stronger now than it is for something 2,000 years ago.
Right.
And so it becomes increasingly irrational to suggest that multiple reports from people on both sides of an issue can't get us to something close to a good understanding of what likely happened. Now, I don't think you can be absolutely certain about anything, let alone, historical claims. But you can be. What you can say is, in the 20th century, we have countless reports of a war. We have video footage, photographs, and we have accounts from people who claimed to be there, who survived that, who lost family members there. And so, yes, in 2,000 years, Holocaust denialism might be slightly more plausible than it is now, but what you're kind of overlooking is that as our ability to record and save information and make sure that it doesn't change over time, when you have digital recordings of things, and you can never prove absolutely that something hasn't been manipulated or that the masterminds at Google are secretly going in and changing all of this. But that is a claim that is itself extraordinary, and you would need to demonstrate the likelihood of that.
Right.
This is very different from, hey, we have this book, and it's a collection of writings, most of those writings, we have no idea who the author is. We know currently from the information, we have no originals. No original manuscripts at all, let alone who wrote them. And all of these were collected by believers, and they essentially held councils to vote on what was getting in and what wasn't. We don't tend to vote on what gets put into the history books.
Well, Texas does.
That's the history textbooks that we give to kids. But it's like the Library of Congress is, if you write a book and you get an ISBN, it's going in.
Yeah.
hmm
Does that make sense?
I mean, what you're saying makes sense. Like, I understand everything you're saying. It's just there's variances in certain things that I either don't necessarily agree with or I think are being misrepresented. And not purposely, I don't think.
Like what?
Saying, well, like the issue of the New Testament documents not having independent attestation of, like, say, those who didn't have a bias or didn't affirm it to be true, stuff like that. When, from what I've read, there's plenty of that, actually.
Wait,
Like
where?
Well, I mean, the Jewish Talmud, first of all, I mean, they write about Jesus and not in a very flattering, light way. I mean, but they write about him and that he was a blasphemer. And I mean, that to me is probably the best attestation you could get, is someone who hates you and is still saying, at the very least, there are claims written about him that happen to be in the New Testament that are true.
That would be
that's just one of the things.
That would be a good point if you were arguing against a claim of mythicism. But it's not a good point if you were arguing for divinity, because the Talmud...
No, I'm not arguing... Yeah, I'm sorry, man. I'm not arguing for theism at all.
I just lost my headset.
Oh,
I'm sorry. Let me know when you're back.
Can you
yeah,
hear?
I can hear. I can hear just fine. Okay, so I know, because we've had this conversation before as
back.
well, that you're not trying to argue for divinity yet. You're trying to establish a baseline of Jesus existed, and then we can go from there. Is that right?
No, that was definitely in the context of the conversation that you, Eric, and I had. This was just mainly on consistency of you need independent attestation for a book that is compiled of independent attestation. That's the part where I was getting hazy.
I guess my question for you then is that if you're not trying to argue for divinity and you're not arguing on behalf of theism, then why would you care? Why should we care?
Why would I care about what?
Whether or not we can use the Bible to prove the Bible.
Well, like, basically, it seems like there's if what I'm saying is right, and that's a big if, I'm sure. If you're saying you need independent attestation, but the compilation itself is the independent attestation, then there's got to be something else that you're actually meaning, and you're looking for something else to verify the validity of the independent attestation.
But I described that. What we're looking for is unbiased sources, and preferably sources that are in opposition. And so when you go to, like, the Talmud, and you look at the passages that some people would view as talking about Jesus, there's a lot of problems with them, because you've got Yeshua ben Pintera and a view that he was killed in, almost the 2nd century CE. That clearly can't be talking about the same Jesus. So, but even if it was, even if the Talmud included, around this year, give or take a couple, there was a heretic who was killed at the hand of Pontius Pilate, etc. None of that gets to. Can you still hear me if I talk? Because my headset went out. There it is. None of that gets to whether or not these events occurred, the miraculous events, the things that might lead to divinity, and there were plenty of potential messiahs and plenty of people whose name was Yeshua, and to just argue that because there was a mention that this then affirms not only the existence of the particular one that you're talking about, that's a problem. You may be right, you may not. But none of that gets us any closer to whether or not this was not just an itinerant rabbi who was preaching heretical things, but whether or not this was the Son of God who died for our sins. And plus, I don't even think we need to go into potential evidence for that, because the notion is absurd in the first place.
So if there were more, like, say, archaeology discovers, in 100 years that there's a bunch of more, unbiased, opposition attestations for, Jesus, Yeshua, whatever. I mean, couldn't we just say the same thing? Because you're saying, like, we need it to be unbiased. We need it from the opposition. That would give it more credibility. But even if we had that, couldn't you say the exact same thing? Well, we don't know that they're talking about that Yeshua.
Well, yeah, we would need them to talk about that.
We need to be pretty specific. Here's the big question you need to ask, Jonathan.
Go ahead.
If there is a God, and the story about Jesus is true, where God essentially takes human form and comes down and sacrifices himself to serve as a loophole for rules that he created. And it is important for us now, 2,000 years later, to have an evidence-based, warranted belief in this in order to accept it. Then how could we ever be having discussions and debates with confusion about which Jesus we're talking about, or are we talking about Jesus, and we can't verify miracles? If there is a God, that God has utterly failed at understanding good standards of evidence, because there should be no debate. This has got to be, if this is all true, this has got to be the single most important thing in the entire history of the world. And it is not sufficiently attested to and backed up with evidence, and that has to be God's fault. What kind of idiot does this?
Yeah, and I see what you're saying, but there's, and again, you could be skeptical to the point of being like irrational, right? So, I mean, any level of evidence that should, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Skepticism is rational. Skepticism is not, I don't believe. Skepticism is a process by which we want our internal model of reality to match reality. And so we are not going to become convinced of things until the evidence warrants it. Skepticism is not cynicism. It's not debunking. It is not saying, no. It is impossible. It is impossible. It is impossible to be too skeptical.
Okay. Why do you say that?
Because skepticism is about testing to be as correct as possible. Can you be too correct?
No, I guess you can't be too correct.
There you go.
You can't have like too much evidence. But it's like, I could say I don't believe that my mother and my father are actually my mother and father, even though to me that's too skeptical. Like I have no reason not to believe it.
That's not too skeptical.
DNA test.
You can deny whatever you want. You can be a Holocaust denier, but you can't say that you're doing it because you're skeptical.
Right, exactly.
You don't understand skepticism if you think that you can be too skeptical. And that's why I said, can you be too correct? Because that's what skepticism is. It is, let's use the best methods to avoid being wrong. Now, can you be wrong and still be skeptical? Absolutely. Because for some things, there may not ever be enough evidence to warrant it. I have no idea what happened before the Big Bang, or whether that sentence even makes sense.
Right, yeah.
But that's my skepticism is I'm going to believe it when the evidence warrants it, and not a moment before. Because if I believe it before the evidence warrants it, now I'm being unskeptical, I am being gullible, I am being irrational. And if I deny that something exists when there is sufficient evidence for it, that's also not skepticism.
Right, exactly.
Mm-hmm. So, like, being like a hard solipsist is not like skeptical, like of other people actually existing.
No, being a hard solipsist is asserting a position that you can't demonstrate, and that would not be consistent with skepticism. Being a soft solipsist is consistent with skepticism because that's an acknowledgement that I cannot demonstrate that I'm not the only mind in the world.
Okay. I didn't know the distinction between those two.
Yeah.
Hard solipsism is nobody exists but me.
Which then is a claim that you cannot prove or disprove, and therefore it's illogical to hold it.
Yeah, essentially it's about falsifiability. I can't falsify the proposition there is no God. I can't falsify the proposition. Well, that's falsifiable by demonstrating that a God exists.
Right.
But I cannot demonstrate that it's not the case that it is the case that I am in fact the only mind. There's no way to show that that's false.
Mm. So, I mean, like something that's like extremely well attested scientifically, or with the best methods that we have on determining what's more probable to be true. Like pick something like how stars form, or something that's easy that we understand through physics and astronomy and stuff. For someone to actually be aware of all of this evidence and information and say, I'm still not convinced, that to you is not being too skeptical when all of the evidence suggests that it's true?
No, they're not being too skeptical. They're being irrational.
So skepticism doesn't have anything to do with it. It just goes straight to irrationality.
Skepticism would say, when there's sufficient evidence, I will accept it. And you are describing a scenario where there is sufficient evidence, but someone won't accept it. That's not skepticism, that's cynicism.
Isn't that subjective, though, to the individual?
It's going to be up to you to determine what is going to convince you or not. But you can't claim that your standards of being convinced are objectively correct. That's something you'd need to demonstrate. For example, you could say, well, you could be the doubting Thomas thing. I'm not going to believe Jesus until he's standing in front of me and I see the nail holes in my hand, which, by the way, is not sufficient evidence to warrant belief in that.
Right.
But you could do something like that. Or you could say, I don't believe you have $100 in your wallet, and I open my wallet and show it to you. And you could say, I don't believe it still. Well, now you're not engaged in skepticism. You're engaged in denialism or cynicism. And you can sit there all day and be convinced that you're rational, but you're clearly not. This would be like saying, I don't believe this pen works, and then I write your name and say, read that to me, and you read it, and then you say, I still don't believe that pen works. That is what you're trying to describe as too skeptical, but that's not skepticism. Because skepticism...
But it sounds like you're describing proof rather than evidence, because evidence can be wrong. But proof is conclusive.
No. So first of all, proof is a mathematical term. What we're talking about in science is demonstrating something with sufficient evidence, but also every position we hold should be tentative, and our confidence in that position should be proportional to the evidence. Mathematics has proof. Proof in the colloquial sense is just give me a demonstration, and you're saying, oh, well, that's sufficient.
Right. I think the issue here is that we're working off of different terms, and Matt, you're kind of going off of the more technical terms of what skepticism is, what a proof is. And Jonathan, it sounds like you're using them how like normal everyday people would use the term proof or skepticism, but they're not the same thing. They're different concepts. Just like a theory in science is different than when I say I have a theory that Matt's gonna oversleep today. You know?
Sure, that makes sense.
Yeah, so I think that this is, again...
well, that raises an interest. How would you define theory, Jonathan?
So I have... When I think of the word theory, I think there's like three theories. There's unproven theories, disproven theories, and proven theories. So I kind of... When it comes to a theory is something like the theory of gravity, where the apple hits you in the head, and all of a sudden...
The thing is, once it becomes disproved, it's no longer a theory.
A theory in science is the highest thing that an idea, a hypothesis, can achieve.
Yeah, best describes like the event or whatever it is that's being investigated as the best model for it.
Yeah, a theory or model is essentially... There's an observation. Now, granted, there isn't a scientific method. There are a bunch of scientific methods. But if you begin with an observation, you create a hypothesis, then you investigate and try to come up with evidence that affirms that hypothesis, and then you attempt to disprove that hypothesis. And then there's the whole thing surrounding peer review and independent investigation, because the truth has nothing to fear from inquiry. And so if it's true that Jesus is the Son of God, then we would expect, A, there would be evidence for it, unless there's some reason for God to hide that evidence, in which case he can't expect people to accept it if he's hiding the evidence. God is playing world hide-and-seek champion every year. But if God is not providing enough evidence, then the fault now rests with God. If there's just not enough evidence, then all you can say is, I am not convinced, and no reasonable person could be convinced.
And you're talking in general on a general claim, not like theism altogether. I mean, not just theism, right?
Any claim.
Yeah,
The claim doesn't matter. For different claims, there's different evidential standards. Like if somebody tells me, hey, I mentioned this earlier and many times in the past, hey, I just got a new puppy. Cool. I'm going to take you at your word because I know that puppies exist and people have them as pets, and I know things about you and everything else. And I'm saying that knowing that I could in fact be wrong. But the consequences of me being wrong doesn't shake my worldview from an epistemological standpoint. It just means you are no longer trustworthy. Now, if you say, I just was abducted by aliens last night, now all of a sudden the nature of the claim has changed, and this type of evidence that we would expect for that should change as well. And so when you
Right.
say
Okay.
Jesus is divine and performed miracles and rose from the dead and wants you to stop having gay sex and do all the things that he wants in order for you to live in paradise forever, that's a collection of claims that's incredibly extraordinary and would need more evidence than stories of translations of stories by anonymous authors thousands of years ago.
Right. If Yeshua, this rabbi, was just one more of there were 36, something like that, different sects of Judaism that had broken off into cults of different apocalyptic natures around that same time period. If it was just one of those various cults, and you said, hey, this existed at this point in time, I'd be like, okay, sure, fine, I'll go with that, because it doesn't impact me or my worldview. But once you make the claim that it's supposed to impact me and my worldview, then I need more evidence than I would for other claims. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely, it makes sense. It makes perfect sense. I think that way in my daily life as well, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I've been watching the atheist experience for 10 years, at least 10 years. My best friend is an atheist. I read books from atheist authors. I read books from Christian authors, apologists, stuff like that. Why? It is going to be maybe difficult for you to even attempt to answer, but how come I feel like I am being rational and coming to the conclusion that I believe the claims that are written about Jesus in the New Testament? I feel like I'm a rational person. I feel like I'm a critical thinker. I understand logic and reason. Why am I coming to an opposite conclusion?
Right. We demonstrated this earlier. You already said that you don't believe people are being abducted by aliens.
Right.
That means that you have one standard of evidence for the alien claim and a lesser standard of evidence for the Jesus claim. And the question you have to ask yourself is, why are you setting the bar so low for the Jesus claim and much higher for the alien abduction claim? It comes down to somewhere there's a hidden bias. Either it's fear of the consequences of being wrong. The consequences of being wrong about God are greater than the consequences of being wrong about alien abductions. Or maybe you have some hidden desires related to family members, as we discussed before, or an afterlife, or some preference for something that you're not willing to acknowledge yourself. But I would think that both of us would agree you have a lower standard of evidence for the Jesus claim than you do for the alien abduction claim.
I don't know. I don't know if I do or not. And even if I do, I don't know how I'd actually be able to determine that.
It's really easy. There are many claims about people being abducted, and you can go and talk to them firsthand and hear their account. And in many cases, you can go out and investigate things. They are closer to you temporally, in temporal proximity, in that maybe somebody thinks they got abducted by aliens in the last couple of years. You can talk to them, you can investigate, and you can look into this evidence, and yet I would bet that you don't, and you don't believe them. And yet, when it comes to the Jesus thing, you have sources that you cannot identify, cannot name, cannot talk to. You have no way to investigate these things. You are much farther removed from them in time, and the claim is vastly more extraordinary because the alien claim doesn't violate necessarily the physical laws in the universe. There's nothing supernatural about the notion that life might have come from somewhere else to here, that there might be advanced technology. So you are accepting a much more extraordinary claim based on worse evidence.
So to kind of be specific, I have specific reasons why I don't think that alien life is probable. I don't know. I'm not here saying I know God exists. I wouldn't do that because it's monumentally arrogant, I think. I have to believe it because the arguments that I have, spent 10 years reading about and learning about, and the vast amount that I've learned from the show, has just led me to the conclusion that in my mind, the way that I use my epistemology or whatever, it has led me to the belief that this is more probably true.
Take the last three sentences you said, and replace any reference to God or religion with aliens or alien abductions. And why is it?
Well, that's not the same. It's not the same thing because I'm aware of evidence that makes alien life unlikely.
Okay, so what is that evidence? Because we know, no. Science shows that alien life is not only incredibly likely, but probable. Whether or not they come here, whether or not they have technology where they could come here and abduct people is a separate issue. But life outside of Earth is wholly unremarkable. Do you know how big the universe is? It's far more improbable that life only exists on this one little frickin' rock.
Okay, Jonathan.
I am.
Jonathan.
Yep.
Okay, so we are going to have to move on, I think, to some other callers. But I have some homework for you if you would like to call back. Make a list. Awesome, me too. Make a list of the reasons you don't accept alien abduction. And then make a list of, and then compare claims about Jesus' existence to that list.
And I want to finish the one, when you're done, I want to finish the one thought that kind of got sidetracked. Because when I said take the last three sentences and anywhere that references God or religion, substitute alien abduction, and you interrupted right away, and it's fine, I interrupt too, it's not a big deal. What I was going to say is, if you literally go back and type out what you said and change it so that it is three sentences about alien abductions, ask yourself, how is it, if someone who believes there were alien abductions said those three sentences to you, how would you reply? That's where I was going.
Mm-hmm. So do some thinking on that. Maybe write out a little bit of a list and call back next week and we'll continue the conversation.
Okay, I will definitely give it a shot. And I don't want to promise that I can get back to you next week, but I will definitely call back again when I have a chance.
Awesome.
And I had a great time talking with you guys. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for
Jonathan.
calling in. I think another thing to bring up is just that argumentum ad populum is the fallacy of assuming things are true because a large portion of the population agrees with you. I think that subconsciously that is an extremely important thing that people grab onto. If we lived in a society that was built around the acceptance of aliens, it would be a lot more likely that you also accepted that aliens existed.
That is a brilliant point.
Right? So, if you are living in this society, whether or not you think you have individual personal biases, you are biased just by default because of the way our society is set up and because of the number of people who are theist in the society.
Yeah, skepticism is about doing whatever you can to remove as much of your personal bias as possible. You're never going to be a perfect thinker, a perfect skeptic. You're not going to get rid of all your biases, but doing everything you can to figure out what those are. And if you have a different standard of evidence, a lower standard of evidence for something that is obviously more extraordinary, you got to ask why.
Exactly.
And maybe what V was pointing out about the popularity of this, that might be the biggest thing.
Yeah, ask yourself, am I believing this because other people also believe this thing? That kind of was a big part of my deconversion.